Rich woman sends her arrogant son to the countryside as punishment, but when she visits him, she cannot contain her tears. In the high-rise penthouse overlooking the bustling city, Beatrice sat across from her son, Arthur, a young man with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. The tension between them was almost palpable. Beatrice had always been a woman of control, and here she was, feeling as if she had lost all of it. Watching her son, so dismissive, so smug, she felt both anger and disappointment rising within her. "Arthur," she began, her tone steady yet cold, "I can't recognize the boy I raised in the man you're becoming." She paused, her gaze steady on him, as he barely looked up from his phone, scrolling through an endless stream of social media updates. Arthur scoffed, "Is this another lecture on values and respect, mother? I already know how this goes." His voice dripped with sarcasm, and a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Beatrice clenched her fists under the table. Arthur had been raised in luxury. Anything he wanted was his without question. And now he was spoiled, ungrateful, dismissing everyone around him as if they were beneath him. He had a habit of treating her hard-earned wealth and the privileges it afforded him as his by right. "Arthur," Beatrice's voice cut through his defiance, her tone icier than before. "You may think you're untouchable, that you deserve all of this simply because of who you are. But I am your mother, and I will not stand by and watch you turn into someone who thinks wealth defines character." Arthur rolled his eyes and sat back, crossing his arms. "Right. You built this empire on hard work, integrity, blah blah blah. I've heard it a million times. But times have changed, mother. I don't need some grand life lesson from you." Beatrice's eyes darkened. It was time to break the cycle. "That's enough." Her tone was final, and something in it made Arthur glance up. "Starting tomorrow," she continued, "you're going to live with your grandparents. I've already arranged everything. You'll spend the next few months there." Arthur's eyes widened, and for the first time in the conversation he looked truly shocked. "Are you serious? You can't be serious." "I am completely serious, Arthur." Beatrice held her ground, unwavering. "You'll be leaving first thing tomorrow morning." Arthur laughed, a sound that was part disbelief and part mockery. "You're sending me to the countryside? To a farm? You're joking. What do you expect me to learn from herding cows and living in a shack?" Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his. "Humility," she said softly, though her words struck with the force of a hammer. "Respect. The value of hard work. Your grandparents live a simple life, but they are some of the kindest, hardest working people I know. Maybe that's what you need. A reminder of what life is like without all this." She motioned around the penthouse. "Privilege?" Arthur sat stunned, clearly grappling with his disbelief and growing indignation. "So you're punishing me because I won't sit here and pretend I care about your values? This is ridiculous." Beatrice didn't flinch. "You have been given every privilege, every opportunity, and yet you've become entitled, arrogant, disrespectful. If the city and everything I've worked for hasn't taught you gratitude, then perhaps the countryside will." The silence that followed was heavy. Arthur shook his head, his mouth set in a firm line. "Fine," he spat, getting up from the table. "If you want me out of your sight, then consider it done. But don't expect me to come back singing your praises." Beatrice watched him storm out, her heart a mix of sadness and resolution. She'd done this out of love, a tough love she hoped would finally reach him. She could only hope that this time away from the city, stripped of his luxuries, would lead Arthur to see the world, and himself, in a new light. The next morning, Arthur was jostled awake before dawn by the shrill ring of his alarm, a rude reminder of the strange new world he was about to enter. Groggy and irritable, he dragged himself out of bed and found the suitcase his mother had packed. It was heavier than he expected, packed with clothes he barely recognized, plain jeans, flannel shirts, and sturdy boots, far from his usual designer wardrobe. Beatrice waited by the door, her face impassive, though her eyes betrayed a glimmer of both hope and apprehension. The journey to his grandparents' farm took hours by train, each one seeming to stretch longer than the last. Arthur sulked in his seat, headphones jammed over his ears, ignoring the curious stares of fellow passengers as he scrolled endlessly through his phone. But soon the city skyline faded into rolling fields, and the signal bars on his phone vanished one by one. Frustrated, He pocketed his phone and slumped back into his seat, resigned to staring out at endless fields of green, dusty roads, and the occasional farmhouse. When the train finally screeched to a halt at a small, lonely station, Arthur felt a pang of disbelief. A single platform stood in the middle of nowhere, with only a rusted sign that read Monte Alegre. He scowled, hauling his suitcase off the train, his polished shoes dusty the moment they touched the platform. A familiar, warm voice called out, "Arthur, over here." It was his grandfather, Jorge, with his familiar, worn-out smile and a kind gaze that seemed completely unaffected by time. Arthur had to squint to recognize him. The older man's clothes were simple, and his face was tanned from years of working under the sun. Jorge stepped forward with his arms out, but Arthur gave him only a small nod, his expression as cold as the city he'd left behind. "Welcome to Monte Alegre," Jorge said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Your grandmother's fixing up a warm meal back at the house. She's been talking about your arrival all week." Arthur forced a smile, but it barely masked his annoyance. "This place is quiet," he muttered, looking around with thinly veiled disdain. Jorge laughed good-naturedly, ignoring the unenthused tone. "You'll get used to it, son. Out here there's no noise, no rushing around. Just the birds, the wind, and good honest work." The drive back to the farmhouse was a slow, bumpy one. Arthur stared out the window at endless fields, his heart sinking with every turn down a dusty road that seemed to lead them further from anything resembling civilization. When they finally pulled up to the farmhouse, he stared at the modest home with disbelief. The paint was peeling, and the yard was littered with farm equipment and baskets of vegetables. The scent of earth and grass filled the air, a stark contrast to the faint perfume of his mother's penthouse. Arthur's grandmother, Rosa, bustled out of the house with a smile that softened her lined face. She opened her arms to him, but he only offered her a quick, stiff hug. "Oh, Arthur," she beamed, as though his icy reception hadn't fazed her. "Look at you, so tall and handsome. Come inside. I made your favorite stew, and there's fresh bread too." Inside, Arthur was greeted by the cozy, humble setting of the farmhouse kitchen, filled with the rich smell of stewed vegetables, herbs, and warm bread. But even as he sat down, eyeing the spread his grandmother had lovingly prepared, he couldn't help but wrinkle his nose at the plain furniture, the faded curtains, and the absence of anything remotely modern. The walls were lined with old photos and decorations, all homemade or worn with age, and the only sound was the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Jorge poured him a glass of fresh milk, pushing it toward him with a kind smile. "Give it a try, Arthur. You'll feel the strength of the farm in it." Arthur eyed the glass skeptically. "Don't you have any bottled water?" he asked, setting the milk aside. Rosa and Jorge exchanged a glance, her smile faltering for the first time. "Well, we only drink water from the well, Arthur. It's the purest you'll find," Rosa explained softly, her tone gentle yet firm. Arthur pushed back his chair. "Look, I appreciate all this, but I didn't ask to be sent here, okay? So don't expect me to. I don't know, play along." The room fell silent, and Arthur could feel the weight of his words in the stillness. His grandparents, as if sensing his discomfort, merely nodded. "Arthur," Jorge began with a patient smile, "we know this is all new to you. It'll take time to get used to our ways. Just try to relax and let this place teach you a thing or two. You may find you learned something valuable." But Arthur only shrugged, barely acknowledging his grandfather's words. As soon as he finished his meal, he retreated to the small room they had prepared for him. The room was simple, just a small bed and a wooden dresser. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. Frustrated, he threw himself on the bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. The isolation felt stifling. He already missed the familiar buzz of the city, the comforts he was used to. Here, it was as if the world had stopped, leaving only the ticking clock and the sound of crickets outside. The silence was maddening. 3 months of this, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "No way I'm going to make it." He glanced at the closed door, his mind racing with thoughts of rebellion. He would find a way out of this. He was sure of it. The following morning, Arthur was woken by a loud, unfamiliar noise. His eyes shot open, and he sat up abruptly, squinting at the bright light flooding through the open window. The rooster crowed again, and he groaned, burying his head under his pillow. He had barely slept. The farmhouse was too quiet, the bed too stiff, and the constant ticking of the clock in his room had kept him awake for what felt like hours. He missed the city's hum, the sound of cars on the streets below, and the glow of neon lights that filtered into his room through blackout curtains. Just as he was about to drift back to sleep, a loud knock jolted him awake. "Arthur! Breakfast in 10 minutes!" His grandfather called from the other side of the door. Arthur rolled over, pulling the pillow tighter around his head. He'd hoped that if he ignored them, they might let him sleep. But another knock came, this time followed by the sound of the door creaking open. "Up and at 'em, Arthur," Jorge said cheerfully, stepping into the room. "The animals don't feed themselves, you know." Arthur groaned, muttering under his breath, "I didn't sign up to be some farmhand." But his grandfather only chuckled, handing him a pair of worn-out jeans and a faded plaid shirt. "That's how we do things here. I thought a young man like you would be eager for a bit of work." He gave Arthur a friendly pat on the shoulder before heading back down the hallway. Arthur reluctantly got out of bed and changed into the clothes, feeling out of place in the faded flannel and jeans. When he trudged into the kitchen, his grandmother, Rosa, greeted him with a warm smile as she set a plate of eggs and toast in front of him. There was a bowl of fresh fruit, a pot of honey, and a glass of milk that he avoided, reaching instead for water from a jug on the table. "We start our day early around here," Rosa explained as he poked at his food. "Gotta get the animals fed, and the crops watered before the sun's too high." Arthur stared blankly at her, hoping she was joking. But when he glanced across the table at Jorge, he saw nothing but a gentle smile and calm determination. "What exactly am I supposed to be doing?" Arthur asked, trying to hide his frustration. Jorge chuckled. "We'll start with the chickens, and then move on to the goats. After that, there's the vegetable garden that needs some tending. You'll get the hang of it soon enough." "Right," Arthur said, rolling his eyes. "Because a few chickens and some crops are all it takes to keep this place going." But when Jorge led him out to the barn, Arthur realized that life on the farm was much more work than he'd imagined. As they reached the chicken coop, Arthur wrinkled his nose at the earthy smell and tried not to cringe when he saw the chickens clucking and scratching at the ground. He'd never been this close to a live chicken before, and he definitely hadn't expected to be handling one. Jorge handed him a small metal bucket. "You'll collect the eggs, son. Just reach under the hens carefully. They're not dangerous, but they don't like sudden movements. If you're gentle, they'll be gentle too." Arthur eyed the chickens, trying to keep his distance. "You expect me to just stick my hand under them?" Jorge laughed. "Exactly. Come on, give it a try." Hesitantly, Arthur crouched down next to the nearest chicken. It clucked and ruffled its feathers, eyeing him with what he swore was an indignant glare. He grimaced and tentatively reached his hand under the hen, half expecting it to peck him. When it didn't, he fumbled around until his fingers brushed against a warm, smooth egg. Triumphant, he pulled it out and dropped it into the bucket, breathing a sigh of relief. "There you go," Jorge said, clapping him on the back. "Not so hard, is it?" Arthur muttered something unintelligible, feeling ridiculous, but he kept going, collecting the rest of the eggs with slightly less hesitation. By the time they moved on to the goats, his hands were sore and his arms felt heavy. The goats weren't any easier. They were curious creatures, nudging him and occasionally nipping at his clothes as he tried to clean their pen. Each step of the morning routine was dirty, tiring, and somehow incredibly tedious. Finally, they made their way to the vegetable garden. Rows of greens sprouted up from the soil, stretching out under the morning sun. Jorge handed Arthur a small hoe and showed him how to loosen the soil around the plants and pull out weeds. Arthur barely listened, his mind wandering back to the city, his friends, and his life of ease and luxury. "This is ridiculous," he muttered as he half-heartedly dug at the ground. "All this work, and for what? A few vegetables." Jorge straightened up, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "For food, Arthur. Food that we eat, and sometimes sell at the market. It's hard work, but it's honest. And when you work with your own two hands, you learn to appreciate the value of what you've got." Arthur didn't answer. Instead, he focused on the dirt beneath him, feeling a strange mix of anger and resentment as he hacked at the soil. By midday, his back ached, his hands were blistered, and his clothes were streaked with dirt. All he wanted was a long, hot shower and a comfortable bed, neither of which seemed likely anytime soon. When they finally stopped for lunch, Rosa had set out a meal of fresh bread, cheese, and roasted vegetables. Arthur barely looked at his grandparents as he ate, too tired and frustrated to make conversation. But Jorge watched him closely, a patient smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You did good work today, Arthur," he said after a while. "Tomorrow we'll tackle the cornfield. We're nearly ready for harvest, so we'll need all hands on deck." Arthur couldn't help himself. "Are you serious? You actually expect me to do this all over again tomorrow?" Rosa laid a gentle hand on his arm. "Arthur, we know this isn't what you're used to, but hard work has a way of grounding you, making you stronger. Give it time. You'll see." But Arthur wasn't convinced. To him, this was nothing but a punishment, a grueling, pointless exercise in manual labor. As the day dragged on and the work continued, he grew more and more frustrated. By evening, he was exhausted, sore, and miserable. That night, lying in the dark, Arthur stared up at the ceiling, frustration and resentment churning in his chest. He thought of his mother, safe and comfortable in the penthouse, far away from this rural nightmare. She'd done this to him, sent him out here to waste his summer on pointless work in the middle of nowhere. And he was determined not to give her the satisfaction of seeing him accept it. "I'll find a way out of here," he muttered to himself, clenching his fists. "I won't let her win." In the silent room, with only the faint sound of crickets outside, Arthur lay awake, formulating his plan. The next morning, Arthur trudged out of bed, his body still sore from the previous day's work. His mind, however, was resolute. He'd spent half the night tossing and turning, his frustration boiling over until he'd finally come to a decision. He would leave. He couldn't spend another day here, wasting his time feeding chickens and pulling weeds. He would figure out a way to get back to the city on his own, even if it meant taking every dusty backroad from here to the nearest train station. He grabbed his backpack and stuffed it with the few things he thought he'd need, mostly his phone, a charger, and the bit of cash he'd hidden from his mother before leaving. He stepped quietly past his grandparents' room, hoping they wouldn't hear him, and slipped out the back door. The sun had barely risen, casting a faint golden glow over the fields. Arthur glanced back at the farmhouse, a tiny sliver of guilt settling in his chest. But he quickly brushed it off. They were nice people, sure, but they couldn't seriously expect him to stay here, could they? Arthur walked down the gravel road leading away from the house, feeling a strange rush of freedom as he put distance between himself and the farm. But as he reached the edge of the property, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "Arthur!" His grandfather's voice called out, firm but calm. Arthur turned to see Jorge standing a few yards away, his arms crossed and a serious expression on his face. "Where do you think you're going?" Jorge asked, his voice calm but unwavering. Arthur tried to maintain his confidence, though his heart was pounding. "I'm going back to the city. This place isn't for me." Jorge's eyes softened, but his posture remained firm. "Arthur, I know this is a change for you, but running away won't fix anything." Arthur scowled. "I don't belong here, Grandpa. I don't know what my mom was thinking, sending me out to this place. I don't care about feeding chickens or digging up weeds. It's pointless." Jorge stepped closer, his expression turning serious. "Pointless, you say? This farm may seem simple to you, but it's kept this family going for generations. It's provided for us, given us purpose. You might not understand that now, but if you give it a chance, you just might." Arthur shook his head, frustrated. "I don't care about all that. I'm not like you, okay? I don't want to spend my life breaking my back for what?" Jorge interrupted, his tone sharp. "For food on the table? For a life lived with purpose? Arthur, I know you've had an easy life, but there's more to living than luxury." Arthur opened his mouth to argue, but Jorge held up a hand, silencing him. "You think you're above this, don't you?" Jorge continued, his gaze piercing. "You think just because you've grown up in the city, you don't have anything to learn from us. But life has a way of humbling all of us, Arthur. And you're not above hard work." Arthur clenched his fists, the familiar resentment flaring up. "This isn't fair. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be shipped out here to the middle of nowhere. Jorge's gaze softened, his tone shifting from firm to gentle. I know you didn't, son. But sometimes the things we don't ask for are the things we need most. You think life's handed you everything. But one day, you'll realize that the real things of value are the ones you've earned. Arthur felt the anger boiling over, his mind clouded with frustration and resentment. I don't care what lesson you think I need to learn. I'm not staying here. Without another word, he turned on his heel and started down the road, fully intending to leave his grandfather standing there. But just as he reached the gate, Jorge's voice stopped him once more. Arthur, he called, a note of sadness in his voice. If you go, you'll miss out on the chance to discover what you're truly capable of. Arthur froze, his grandfather's words lingering in the morning air. Something about the tone, gentle but filled with an unmistakable gravity, made him pause. He turned slowly, glancing back at Jorge, who was watching him with a look of quiet understanding. You're free to leave, Arthur, Jorge continued. But remember, we're here to help you find your way, not to hold you back. Arthur hesitated, his resolve wavering. The idea of leaving felt right, but his grandfather's words unsettled him. For reasons he couldn't fully understand, the thought of simply walking away now felt hollow, empty. He looked away, swallowing his pride. Fine, he muttered, turning back toward the farmhouse. I'll stay, but don't expect me to enjoy it. Jorge didn't respond, only nodded and motioned for him to follow. They walked in silence back to the farmhouse, where Rosa was waiting with a warm breakfast and a hopeful smile, as if she hadn't heard a thing. Arthur took his seat at the table, his mood sour, but beneath the anger, a faint sense of curiosity began to stir. The day's work was harder than the last. Jorge had him digging up rows of potatoes, hauling baskets to the storage shed, and fixing a fence that had been knocked down by last night's wind. Each task left Arthur more exhausted than the last, his muscles aching and his patience wearing thin. But he pressed on, partly out of stubbornness, partly because he didn't want to give his grandparents the satisfaction of seeing him quit. As the day wore on, Arthur noticed a subtle change within himself. His resentment, though still present, was tempered by a strange sense of determination. He wanted to prove his grandfather wrong, to show him that he could handle the work without complaint. And even though he hated to admit it, there was something oddly satisfying about seeing the results of his labor. Rows of potatoes piled up, a sturdy fence standing firm, the chickens fed and content. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, exhausted but with a hint of pride he tried to ignore, Jorge watched him with a knowing smile. You did well today, he said simply, passing him a plate of food. Not bad for a city boy. Arthur rolled his eyes, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips. He ate in silence, the warm food filling him with a sense of comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. For a moment, the farmhouse, with its creaky floorboards, the smell of fresh bread, and the sound of his grandparents' quiet conversation, felt almost welcoming. As he lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling once again, Arthur found himself thinking back to his conversation with his grandfather. There was something in Jorge's words that stuck with him, a reminder of something he couldn't quite put into words. The next morning, when Jorge knocked on his door, Arthur got up without complaint. He didn't want to admit it, but a part of him was starting to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something he could learn from this strange, slow life on the farm. The morning sun was already high by the time Arthur finished feeding the chickens. His hands and clothes were covered in dust, and his hair was sticking to his forehead, but he was starting to settle into the rhythm of the work, if only because it was better than staring at the farmhouse walls all day. As he reached for the last of the feed bags, he heard a cheerful voice call out from behind him. Oi, city boy, need any help with those chickens? Arthur turned to see a young man around his age leaning casually against the fence. He wore an old t-shirt and jeans caked with dirt, and his grin was broad and mischievous. His dark curls framed a sun-kissed face, and his hands rested comfortably in his pockets, as if he had all the time in the world. Arthur felt his defenses go up immediately. Who are you? Arthur asked, his tone bordering on defensive. The boy chuckled, clearly unfazed by Arthur's cool reception. Joao, he said, extending a hand. I work on my dad's farm just down the road. Your grandpa mentioned you might need some help settling in, so here I am. Arthur looked at Joao's outstretched hand, and then reluctantly shook it. Joao's grip was strong and confident, a reminder of his own inexperience here. Arthur pulled his hand back, trying to reassert some of his usual aloofness. I don't need any help, Arthur replied. But thanks, I guess. Joao didn't seem to notice or care about the cold response. He hopped over the fence effortlessly and moved past Arthur, crouching down to examine a particularly curious chicken. She's a beauty, this one, he said with a smile, scratching the hen under her chin. You know, chickens are kind of amazing. They're not much to look at, but they keep a farm running like clockwork. Lay eggs, eat the bugs, always busy. Arthur raised an eyebrow. They're just chickens, he muttered, unimpressed. Joao laughed. Maybe they're just chickens, but it's all about how you look at things, isn't it? He straightened up, his expression thoughtful. Out here, you find joy in the little things. Life's slower, but I think it's better that way. Arthur sighed, feeling the weight of Joao's words in a way he didn't want to admit. To him, everything here felt tedious, as if each chore was just another reminder of what he'd left behind. But Joao's smile and easygoing manner made him curious. Why was someone his age so content with so little? So, this is what you do? Arthur asked, half sarcastic, half curious. Just hang around farms and feed chickens. Joao didn't miss a beat. Pretty much. I also help my dad with planting, and I take care of our goats. Once in a while, I play football with some friends from the village. We make our own fun out here. Maybe you'd like to join us sometime. Arthur hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. I don't really do the whole football thing, he replied, crossing his arms. Joao shrugged. Suit yourself. But the offer stands. He grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. Anyway, I'm heading to the river later. It's a great place to cool off after a hot day. You're welcome to come, if you're not too busy with chicken duty. Arthur rolled his eyes but couldn't deny a flicker of interest. The thought of a cool river in the midst of this dusty, sweltering place sounded too good to pass up. Begrudgingly, he nodded. Fine, I'll come. But only because there's nothing else to do around here. Joao laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. That's the spirit, city boy. I'll meet you at the end of the road in an hour. An hour later, Arthur found himself following Joao down a dirt path that twisted through tall grass and wildflowers. The countryside stretched out on either side, the open fields filled with vibrant greens and yellows, and for the first time, he noticed how beautiful it all was. The colors, the open sky, the steady hum of life around him. He'd never experienced anything like this back in the city, where concrete and glass buildings blocked out the sky, and the only greenery was carefully manicured into neat little parks. They reached the river, its clear water glistening under the sun. Joao tossed his shirt on a nearby rock and waded in, grinning as he splashed water at Arthur. Come on in. It's perfect. Arthur hesitated. Back in the city, he wouldn't have been caught dead doing something as uncivilized as swimming in a river. But here, with no one around to judge him, he shrugged off his shirt, kicked off his shoes and waded in, the cool water a welcome relief against his sun-warmed skin. To his surprise, he found himself laughing as Joao splashed him again, the tension and resentment he'd been carrying since arriving on the farm melting away, if only for a little while. So, why do you come to the countryside, really? Joao asked after a while, floating on his back and gazing up at the sky. Arthur let out a bitter chuckle. I didn't come here. I was sent here. My mom thinks I need some kind of character overhaul or whatever. She's convinced that being out here will magically turn me into some kind of humble, hard-working son. Joao nodded, clearly amused. And you think that's all nonsense? Of course it is. Arthur replied. I mean, no offense, but this place, it's too simple. There's nothing here. No restaurants, no entertainment, no anything. Joao shrugged, a small smile on his face. Maybe you're looking at it the wrong way. Simplicity isn't emptiness. You'd be surprised by how much you can find in a quiet place if you're willing to listen. Arthur fell silent, mulling over Joao's words as they drifted in the water. He had to admit, there was a strange peace here that he hadn't felt before. But he wasn't ready to say that out loud. As they headed back to the farm, Arthur felt an unexpected sense of connection. Joao was different from anyone he'd known back in the city. Easygoing, genuine, and completely content with his life. It was refreshing, if also confusing, and Arthur found himself wondering what it was that made Joao so happy with so little. Over the next few days, Joao stopped by the farm more frequently, always with a smile and some new piece of wisdom about life in the countryside. He showed Arthur how to coax milk from a reluctant goat, helped him tend to the vegetable garden, and even taught him a few tricks for gathering eggs without getting pecked. Arthur, to his own surprise, found himself looking forward to these moments. Joao's light-hearted approach to everything, from the grueling farm work to the simplicity of life in the village, was infectious. And Arthur began to realize that his days felt a little less frustrating and a little more satisfying. One evening, as they finished up in the garden, Joao leaned against the fence and looked out over the fields. "You know, city boy," he said with a grin, "you're not half bad at this whole farm thing." Arthur rolled his eyes, but he couldn't hide the faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe, but don't get any ideas. As soon as I can. I'm heading back to civilization." Joao laughed. "Fair enough. But remember, you'll always have a friend here if you need one." "I'm not going anywhere." Arthur glanced at Joao, and for the first time, he didn't feel the need to brush off the comment. He nodded, the weight of the simple words settling into his heart. "Thanks, Joao," he said quietly, surprising even himself. As they stood in the fading light, Arthur felt a sense of calm he hadn't known he was searching for. And though he couldn't admit it yet, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was something out here worth holding on to after all. Arthur awoke before dawn, the chill of early morning air clinging to his skin as he dressed in the now familiar work clothes his grandmother had laid out for him. Each morning, the fabric felt a little less foreign, a little more a part of him. After a few weeks on the farm, the once crushing silence now felt calm and refreshing. Instead of rushing through his chores with resentment, he found himself moving at a steady pace, noticing the sounds and sights around him. The soft clucking of the chickens, the gentle sway of the grass in the morning breeze, the smell of damp earth after a night's rain. Today, he and Jorge were up early to tend to the fields. They'd just started harvesting the corn, and it was tough, hot work. Arthur wasn't looking forward to it, but he was starting to respect the rhythm of it. There was something satisfying about seeing a job through to the end, no matter how small it seemed. As they worked side by side, Jorge occasionally shared stories from his own youth. Memories of how he'd met Rosa, how they'd worked to save the farm after a terrible drought. At first, Arthur had listened with one ear, more focused on finishing his chores than Jorge's tales. But slowly, he found himself drawn in by the stories, and more than that, by the quiet strength in Jorge's voice. He realized that his grandfather was more than just a farmer. He was someone who had faced hardship with resilience and grace, someone who had found contentment in simplicity. They moved to the next row, their hands busy pulling each stalk from the soil and piling it into a large basket. Arthur paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, and as he did, he caught a whiff of something familiar yet different. The earthy, sweet scent of freshly harvested corn. He took a deep breath, the aroma oddly comforting. "Funny thing, huh?" Jorge said, noticing Arthur's contemplative expression. "Most people don't think twice about the food on their plates. They don't know the work that goes into it." Arthur nodded, still a little self-conscious about showing any interest in the work, but unable to deny it either. "Yeah, I never really thought about it before. In the city, food just shows up." Jorge smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's one way to put it. But out here, you see every step, the soil, the water, the patience it takes for something to grow. You put in the work, and eventually you're rewarded. It's like life in that way." Arthur considered this as they moved to the next row. He could feel a strange satisfaction building within him, the feeling of working towards something he could see and touch. Later that afternoon, as they took a break by the river, Jorge filled a small jug with fresh, clear water and poured a glass for Arthur. Arthur accepted it gratefully, taking a long drink and feeling the coolness settle within him. He looked around, taking in the rolling fields, the trees casting long shadows in the sun, and the gentle curve of the river. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jorge said, following Arthur's gaze. Arthur nodded, caught off guard by how true it felt. Yeah, I never noticed it before. But I guess it is. Jorge smiled and patted his shoulder. When you take the time to look, the land has a way of teaching you things. It reminds you to be patient, to appreciate the small blessings. Arthur laughed lightly. I'm not sure how patient I am yet. But I'm starting to see what you mean. They spent the rest of the day harvesting and repairing the fencing around the property. And by the time they finished, Arthur was exhausted but strangely fulfilled. As he ate dinner that night, he found himself savoring each bite, knowing exactly where the food had come from and the effort it had taken to get it on the table. The vegetables, plucked fresh from the garden that morning, tasted richer, the bread warmer and more comforting. When his grandmother passed him a plate of sliced apples, he took a moment to admire the fruit's vibrant color and the subtle, fragrant smell. He couldn't remember the last time he'd noticed something as simple as a fresh apple. You've worked hard today, Rosa said, her warm smile reaching her eyes. It's good to see. Arthur felt a strange sense of pride swell in his chest. He nodded, too tired to say much, but feeling a growing appreciation for the work they did day in and day out. In the following days, Arthur found himself not just going through the motions, but genuinely invested in the tasks around the farm. He began rising early, often before Jorge even knocked on his door. The birds' morning songs became a comforting melody to him, a part of his new routine. He'd even started looking forward to feeding the animals, particularly the chickens, which he'd once viewed as nothing more than smelly and annoying. One morning, as he was filling the water trough for the goats, Joao appeared with a mischievous grin on his face. Look at you, city boy, he teased, watching Arthur with an amused expression. Getting the hang of this farm life, huh? Arthur shrugged, feeling a faint blush creep up his neck. Maybe. It's not as bad as I thought. Still not what I'd choose, but it's different. Joao laughed. Different is good, my friend. The land teaches you to slow down, to appreciate things. A lot of people never get that chance. Arthur nodded thoughtfully, glancing at the wide stretch of land around him. I think I'm starting to see that. I never really looked at things this way before. They worked together for a while in comfortable silence, tending to the goats and cleaning the barn. Afterward, Joao showed him a hidden spot at the edge of the farm, where the grass grew wild and tall, and the view stretched out for miles. They sat together, looking out over the fields, a calmness settling over them as they watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. Do you ever think about leaving? Arthur asked, surprising himself with the question. Joao shook his head. Not really. I mean, I visit the city now and then, but it's not for me. This is home. He looked at Arthur, a thoughtful expression on his face. And who knows? Maybe it could be home for you too. Arthur snorted, though his heart wasn't in it. I'm still a city guy. This place is nice, sure, but it's temporary. But even as he said it, he felt a pang of uncertainty. Each day, he found himself growing more attached to the routines, the people, and the quiet beauty of the land. He was learning to see the world through a different lens, one where value wasn't measured by money or status, but by hard work, simplicity, and a connection to the world around him. That night, as he lay in bed, he replayed the day's moments in his mind. The satisfaction of completing a task, the taste of fresh food, the colors of the sunset. And in the stillness, he realized something surprising. He felt at peace. He missed parts of his old life, sure, but there was a new kind of contentment here, one he hadn't known he needed. As he drifted off to sleep, he found himself wondering what the next day would bring. And for the first time, he wasn't dreading it. He was looking forward to it. Arthur was the first to wake up, slipping quietly into the kitchen to start a pot of coffee. The early morning light crept through the window, casting a soft glow on the modest room. Rosa would often hum while she made breakfast, her voice blending with the gentle sounds of the farm waking up. Today, it was his voice breaking the morning silence with a quiet tune he'd picked up from Joao. He felt almost like an entirely different person in these peaceful morning hours. When Jorge walked in, his eyebrows shot up in surprise at the sight of Arthur at the stove. Well, look at that, he chuckled, a gleam of pride in his eyes. Starting the coffee, are you? Arthur shrugged, but he couldn't quite hide his smile. It seemed like a good way to start the day. I thought I'd make myself useful. Jorge clapped a hand on his shoulder. You're more useful than you know, Arthur. It's good to see you finding your own way. After breakfast, they set out to work, and Arthur moved easily through the tasks that had once felt overwhelming. He helped plant seeds in the garden, shoveling soil with a steady rhythm. His mind focused on each step of the process. He even found himself teaching Jorge and Rosa things he'd learned in school. How to arrange the crops in ways that could help with pest control. How to create a makeshift irrigation system from materials they already had on the farm. That afternoon, as he took a break under the shade of a tree, Arthur spotted Joao and a group of younger children gathered by the old well. Curious, he approached, noting that Joao was attempting to read a tattered storybook aloud. The children listened eagerly, but Arthur could tell Joao was struggling with some of the words. Hey Joao, Arthur called out, nodding to the book. Need a hand? Joao looked up, his cheeks reddening slightly. Sure, if you don't mind. I'm not exactly a pro at this whole reading thing. Arthur took the book and glanced at the eager faces of the children gathered around them. He began to read aloud, his voice carrying the story's rhythm and energy, bringing the words to life. The children's eyes widened as they listened, captivated by the tales of knights, dragons, and far-off lands. When the story ended, the children broke into applause, their faces bright with wonder. One of the younger boys looked up at Arthur with awe. Will you read to us again tomorrow? Arthur found himself nodding, his heart warming at the thought. Sure, I'd like that. As the children scampered off, Joao gave him a grateful smile. You know, you're pretty good at that. I'd love to learn to read like that myself. Arthur was taken aback. Joao had always seemed so confident, so at ease with himself, that he hadn't realized his friend struggled with reading. He didn't hesitate before replying. I could teach you if you want. Maybe we could meet up once or twice a week. Joao's face lit up, and he reached out to shake Arthur's hand, his grip firm and warm. I'd appreciate that, city boy. As they met in the evenings over the following weeks, Arthur began to see yet another side of Joao. For all his confidence and charm, Joao's earnest dedication to learning was humbling. They would sit on a log near the edge of the property, the quiet night surrounding them as Arthur guided Joao through basic words and phrases. By the dim light of a lantern, Arthur taught him how to sound out syllables and recognize the rhythm of sentences, each lesson bringing them closer as friends. Word of Arthur's reading classes spread quickly through the village, and soon he had a small but dedicated group of children and adults alike. They would gather by the well on Saturday afternoons, bringing notebooks and pencils, eager to learn. For the first time in his life, Arthur felt truly useful, not for any achievement he could boast about back in the city, but for something simple and real. His grandparents, especially Rosa, were delighted. She would often linger in the doorway, watching him lead his little class with a mixture of pride and admiration. One evening, after everyone had left, she approached him with a quiet smile. You've done a wonderful thing, Arthur, she said, patting his hand. Teaching them like that, it's a gift, and not just for them. It's a gift to yourself. Arthur looked down, feeling a warm blush on his cheeks. He had never considered himself a teacher, or even particularly selfless. But here, in the village, he felt a strange fulfillment he hadn't known he was looking for. One morning, as he walked into the village with Joao, he noticed the townspeople greeting him warmly, their eyes filled with gratitude and respect. The baker, who had once barely acknowledged him, handed him a fresh roll without charge. A local woman, whose son was in Arthur's reading group, gifted him a small, hand-woven bracelet. Each gesture touched him, a reminder of the growing connection he felt to these people and to this land. You're a part of this place now, Arthur, Joao remarked as they walked. Not just because of the work, but because you've made a difference here. Arthur was quiet, the words sinking in deeply. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to remind himself that this was temporary, that he'd be back in the city soon. But another part, the part that had grown stronger with each passing day, found comfort in the idea of belonging, of making a difference in a way that had nothing to do with wealth or status. One afternoon, Jorge and Arthur sat together on the porch, resting after a long day of work. Jorge handed him a cold glass of lemonade, and they sat in companionable silence, the horizon bathed in the soft hues of sunset. "Arthur," Jorge began quietly, "I can see you've grown. It's not just the work you're doing. It's your heart. You're seeing things with new eyes." Arthur looked down, thinking about all the things he'd learned here. The value of patience, the satisfaction of a day's work, the beauty of small, genuine connections. He nodded slowly. I think I needed this more than I thought. I never expected it, but it's changed me." Jorge smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Sometimes life has a way of giving us exactly what we need, even if we're too stubborn to see it. You're becoming the man you were meant to be, Arthur." The words hit him with a surprising force, filling him with a mix of pride and humility. He had always thought of himself as someone who had it all figured out, but here in the countryside, he was finally beginning to understand who he truly was. That evening, Arthur lay in bed, feeling an unexpected sense of peace. He knew his time on the farm would eventually come to an end, and he would return to the city, to the life he had once missed so desperately. But now he felt the pull of something greater, a connection to this place, to its people, and to the work that had slowly transformed him from the inside out. As he drifted off to sleep, he whispered a silent promise to himself that no matter where he went, he would carry these lessons with him. He would remember the value of simple joys, of hard work, and of the quiet strength that came from belonging. And for the first time, Arthur looked forward to the future, whatever it held, with a heart full of gratitude and hope. Back in the city, Beatrice paced her penthouse office, glancing occasionally at the calendar on her desk. It had been months since she'd sent Arthur to her parents' farm, and though he called her every now and then with brief updates, she could sense something was different. Arthur's usual complaints and demands had softened, replaced by something she could only describe as acceptance. But was he truly changing, or just playing along to avoid the lecture he knew was coming? Unable to shake her curiosity, and truthfully, her growing ache to see her son, Beatrice decided it was time to see for herself. She called her parents, but Jorge's answer was vague, telling her only that Arthur was learning a lot and that it would be good for her to visit. His tone carried a hint of mystery, and though Beatrice's instincts told her not to expect too much, she found herself eager to see what months of farm life had done to Arthur. As her sleek car approached the dusty road leading to her parents' farmhouse, Beatrice took in the open countryside with mixed emotions. The vast fields, the wide skies, and the soft rustle of trees in the wind. It was all so different from her world of polished glass and steel. But for all its unfamiliarity, it felt strangely inviting. Finally, the farmhouse came into view, and as Beatrice pulled into the driveway, she spotted Arthur standing near the barn, his back turned as he worked on fixing a fence. She nearly didn't recognize him. His once meticulously styled hair was tousled and a little sun-bleached, and he wore a plain t-shirt and jeans with an ease she'd never seen in him before. He looked relaxed, his movements fluid and confident as he worked. "Arthur?" she called, stepping out of the car, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. Arthur turned around, and when he saw her, a look of shock and then joy crossed his face. "Mom!" He jogged over, his face breaking into a smile that was warm and genuine, a far cry from the dismissive expressions he used to give her. Without hesitation, he pulled her into a hug, and Beatrice felt her heart swell with emotion. "Hi, Mom," he said, stepping back and grinning. "Didn't expect you out here." Beatrice took a moment to collect herself, her eyes lingering on the boy, no, the young man before her. He seemed different, happier, calmer. "I wanted to see how you were doing," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "It's been a long time." Arthur laughed, scratching the back of his neck. "Yeah, it has. I guess I've been busy." He gestured around, and as if on cue, his grandparents appeared from the house, welcoming Beatrice with warm hugs and exclamations of delight. As they settled into the cozy kitchen, Rosa served fresh coffee and slices of warm apple pie, and Beatrice found herself slipping easily into the rhythm of the conversation. Arthur shared stories about his work on the farm, from the day he'd accidentally released all the chickens, to his reading classes with Joao and the children from the village. He spoke with a light in his eyes she hadn't seen in years, a genuine excitement she hadn't known he was capable of. "You've been teaching?" Beatrice asked, astonished. Arthur nodded, his expression proud but humble. Yeah, I mean it started with Joao. He wanted to learn to read better, so I helped him out. And then a few of the kids asked if I could teach them too, so I figured why not. He shrugged, glancing down. It's been good actually. They're smart kids. I think I learned just as much from them as they do from me. Beatrice was speechless. The boy who had once dismissed any form of responsibility as boring was now helping others, not for recognition or reward, but simply because he wanted to. She felt a lump form in her throat as she watched him interact with his grandparents, treating them with the respect and warmth she had never thought possible. After lunch, Arthur offered to take her on a tour of the farm. They walked together through the fields, Arthur explaining each part of the land, showing her the vegetable garden he had helped plant, and even pointing out a patch where he'd experimented with crop arrangement techniques to help the plants thrive. Beatrice listened, astonished at the depth of knowledge he had gained and the passion with which he spoke. It's amazing, really, Arthur said, his eyes scanning the land around them. Everything here has its own rhythm, its own way of growing and changing. When you work with it, you start to notice things you'd never pay attention to otherwise. It's peaceful. Beatrice smiled, a wave of emotion rushing over her. She remembered sending him here as a last-ditch effort to teach him humility, to show him the value of hard work and gratitude. But she hadn't expected it to work, not like this. Arthur, she said, her voice unsteady. I don't even know what to say. You seem so different. Happier. Arthur looked at her, his expression thoughtful. I am, Mom. I think I needed this place more than I realized. I didn't understand it at first. I thought it was punishment. But now I get it. I had to stop looking down on things, thinking I was above it all. I had to learn that every part of life has value, no matter how simple it seems. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, and Beatrice felt a newfound pride for her son, a pride that went beyond any academic achievement or career aspiration. She was proud of the person he had become, of the humility and kindness he now carried within him. As they returned, a group of children gathered at the edge of the property, calling out to Arthur. He waved, excusing himself with a grin. I promised them a story today. I'll catch up with you later, okay? Beatrice watched him run off, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and amazement. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him this lighthearted, this free. Rosa and Jorge joined her on the porch, both smiling as they watched Arthur interact with the children. Thank you, Beatrice murmured, her voice filled with emotion. I don't know how you did it, but thank you. You've given me back a son I thought I'd lost. Rosa placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. He found himself here, Beatrice. All we did was give him the space to grow, to see the world differently. Jorge nodded, his gaze steady. Sometimes, all it takes is a little distance from what we know to realize who we really are. They sat together on the porch, watching Arthur as he read to the children, his voice carrying through the open air. Beatrice felt a tear slip down her cheek, a mixture of relief and gratitude filling her heart. For so long, she had tried to mold Arthur into what she thought he should be, never realizing that he needed something far simpler. An opportunity to connect with the world in a way that couldn't be bought or taught in a classroom. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the farmhouse, Beatrice felt a sense of peace settle over her. Arthur had not only found himself here, he had found a purpose, a way of being that went beyond the superficial. And in that quiet moment, Beatrice realized that this place, this simple, humble life, had not been a punishment after all. It had been a blessing. As the sun set, Beatrice lingered on the porch, savoring the warmth of the evening air. She could hear Arthur's laughter from around the corner of the farmhouse, mingling with the excited voices of the children he had gathered to read to. She could hardly believe how different he seemed, how genuine his smiles were. Her heart swelled with emotions she couldn't name, pride, relief, and a bittersweet nostalgia for the little boy he'd once been. When Arthur finally finished his story, he walked back toward her, the last of the children waving goodbye as they disappeared down the dirt road. He caught her watching him and raised an eyebrow, giving her a shy, boyish grin that took her by surprise. What? He asked, his voice warm and unguarded. Beatrice shook her head, trying to hold back tears that had been welling up since she'd arrived. I can't believe how much you've changed, Arthur. You seem happy. Arthur walked over to her, leaning against the porch railing. He looked out over the fields, which were bathed in the fading glow of sunset. I think I am, Mom. For the first time, I really am. Beatrice felt a lump form in her throat. She'd worried for so long, fearing that he would never find his way, that he would be forever consumed by the entitlement and arrogance his privileged upbringing had fostered. But here he was, a young man who had found purpose and humility in a place she had once considered too simple for her ambitious son. She reached out, taking his hand, and Arthur didn't pull away. He squeezed her hand back, his gaze soft. You know, she began, her voice trembling, when I sent you here, I was scared. I was scared that you'd resent me, that you'd hate me for it. But I didn't know what else to do. I was watching you slip away, become someone I didn't recognize. I was so afraid that I'd lost you. Arthur looked down, his expression thoughtful. I think in a way, I needed to lose myself to find myself again. Coming here, it forced me to see things differently, to see myself differently. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with an understanding that surprised her. You did the right thing, Mom. I might not have said it back then, but I needed this more than I realized. Beatrice let out a shaky breath, feeling the tears slip down her cheeks. She hadn't realized just how deeply she'd missed her son, the real Arthur. The boy who had always been kind-hearted, curious, and full of potential. She reached up, wiping away a tear, but Arthur placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, guiding her into a warm embrace. They stood there in silence, mother and son, their hearts finally finding peace. Beatrice felt the weight of years of worry and fear melt away as Arthur held her. No longer the rebellious boy, but a young man who had come into his own. After a moment, Arthur pulled back, his eyes bright with emotion. Thank you, Mom, for sending me here, for not giving up on me. Beatrice's voice was thick with emotion as she spoke. I've always believed in you, Arthur. I always knew you had a good heart. You just needed the right place to bring it out. They sat together on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. Arthur began sharing stories of his time on the farm, his friendship with João, and the lessons he'd learned from Jorge. For the first time in years, Beatrice listened to her son not as a figure of authority, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand him. As he spoke, Beatrice realized how much he had changed in ways she hadn't expected. He spoke about the joy he felt in teaching João and the children, the satisfaction of a day's work in the fields, and the quiet peace he'd found in the simple, steady rhythm of farm life. Each word filled her with a sense of awe. It was as if the son she had feared was lost had been waiting all along, just hidden beneath the layers of the city and the lifestyle that had once defined him. The next morning, as Beatrice prepared to leave, she felt a strange sense of loss. Part of her longed to take him back to the city, to return to the life they'd always known. But as she watched him say goodbye to his grandparents, his genuine affection and respect shining through, she knew that he would never be the same, and that this was a good thing. Arthur walked her to her car, an easy silence between them. Just before she opened the door, he turned to her, his face earnest. Mom, he said, his voice steady, I want to come back here. Even after I go back to the city, I want to help Grandpa on the farm, maybe even spend my summers here. I know it sounds crazy, but this place has become a part of me. Beatrice smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. I think that's wonderful, Arthur. You'll always have a place here, and you'll always have me, cheering you on. They hugged once more, and as Beatrice pulled away, she felt a profound sense of peace. Arthur had found something here that no amount of wealth or privilege could ever buy. A sense of purpose, rooted in humility, kindness, and hard work. And in that moment, she realized that she too was changed. She had come here expecting to see a son punished, only to find that they had both been blessed with a second chance. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Arthur wave until he was just a small dot on the road. A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time, it was a tear of joy, of gratitude for the unexpected gift this journey had brought them both. Arthur returned to the city a week after his mother's visit. The city, with its relentless pace and towering buildings, felt strangely foreign to him now. The bright lights and crowded streets, once thrilling, now seemed a little less meaningful. But he carried something with him, a sense of calm and purpose that he hadn't had before. He noticed the difference in himself as he re-entered his old life. He took the bus to his classes instead of insisting on being driven, volunteered to help classmates who struggled, and spent his free time planning his next trip back to the countryside. Beatrice watched these changes with quiet joy, marveling at the new person her son was becoming. She too found herself changed. The experience had softened her, made her more aware of life beyond wealth and success. Inspired by Arthur's new perspective, she decided to make her own adjustments. She began spending more time with Arthur, carving out moments in her schedule to share simple dinners together, to talk without distraction, and to let herself fully be present. One evening, Beatrice and Arthur sat in the living room, flipping through photos he had taken on the farm. She'd seen them before, but something about seeing them with Arthur's commentary made them come alive. There was a picture of him with Joao and the children by the old well, the little ones all crowding around him with bright, eager faces. Another showed him proudly holding up a basket of freshly picked vegetables, a broad, unguarded smile on his face. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked gently, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it. Arthur nodded, a far-off look in his eyes. "I do. But not in the same way I used to miss things. It's more like, I carry it with me. I know it's there, and I'll be back, so I don't feel as if I've lost it." Beatrice smiled, her heart warmed by his words. "Well, you've certainly inspired me," she said, glancing at him with a hint of pride. "In fact, I've been thinking about ways we can give back, not just to the farm, but to people who could use a hand." Arthur's face lit up. "Really? Like what?" "Well, your grandfather mentioned that some families in the village struggle with school supplies and books. I thought we could start a small scholarship fund, or maybe a library for the kids." Arthur's smile widened, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "That's a great idea, Mom. And maybe we can organize a volunteer group to help around the village too. I know some people in my class who'd love to come out and spend a weekend helping out. It could be a whole new way of connecting the city to the countryside." Over the next few months, Arthur and Beatrice worked together to bring these ideas to life. They funded a small but growing library in the village and created a scholarship for the children. Arthur organized trips for his friends and classmates, introducing them to the farm and the work that filled his grandparents' lives. He shared stories of his time there, inspiring others to see the value in a way of life that was simpler, yet filled with meaning. Beatrice, too, found herself returning to the countryside, visiting the village often and getting to know its people. She discovered a profound peace there, one that reminded her of what truly mattered in life. The villagers welcomed her with open arms, and she grew closer to her parents as well, appreciating the wisdom and resilience they had passed down. In the following years, the farm became a cherished place not just for Arthur, but for Beatrice and everyone they had inspired along the way. The scholarship program grew, attracting the attention of local schools and sponsors who wanted to help. Arthur's weekend volunteer trips became a tradition, drawing more city students to experience life on the farm and learn from the land. Beatrice often reflected on how much had changed from that first day she'd sent her son to the countryside, wondering if he would ever forgive her. Now, that decision had become a blessing beyond measure, transforming not only Arthur's life, but her own as well. One summer, as Arthur and Beatrice sat on the familiar farmhouse porch, Jorge joined them, his face warm with pride. "You've done well, Arthur," he said, his voice filled with quiet joy. "The way you've taken these lessons with you, shared them with others, it means a lot. You're giving people a chance to understand things they'd never learn anywhere else." Arthur looked down, his heart full. "It's because of you, Grandpa. You and Grandma, and this place. It taught me more than I ever realized." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur felt a sense of deep gratitude for everything that had brought him to this point. He had grown roots in the countryside, roots that would remain with him no matter where he went. The lessons of the farm, patience, humility, the value of simple joys, had become the foundation of his life. Beatrice rested a hand on his shoulder, her gaze filled with love. She no longer worried about the future, or the kind of man her son would become. Arthur had found his path, and in doing so, he had reminded her of her own. As the sky turned to shades of pink and purple, they sat together on the porch, mother, son, and grandfather, bound by the land, the lessons, and the quiet understanding that this was only the beginning of a new, shared story. For the first time, Arthur felt whole, ready to live a life of purpose, no matter where it led.